Yo guys, what is going on? And welcome to the Barbells and BJJ podcast, episode number 7, I think. I think it's episode number 7. And we're going to be going back to the evidence hierarchy today. As I said, it's a very, very important topic within the fields of sports and exercise science and really any medicinal field. It's very, very important to understand these concepts, what different studies are, what they can and cannot show, etc., etc. Now, today we're going to be going over case studies, what case studies are, what they're useful for, what they're not useful for, what their pros and cons are, some good examples of when case studies have been used to good effect. We're going to be going over all of that today, and I think there's going to be a lot of interesting insights for you to take away from this episode, so please do stay tuned. So, first question you may be asking, what is a case study? Well, a case study is a form of study ideally conducted with a systematic and appropriate approach and methodology on either single participant, a single group, such as a school, business, some form of organization, or situation over a set period of time. That's what a case study is. Whenever you hear case study, just think one participant or one particular group of participants, which would typically be a very, very small sample size. We're looking at a very, very specific case of something, hence the name case study. Some of the key characteristics of case study research are that the phenomena, or what we're looking at, the particular variable we're looking at, is studied through focusing on specific cases, as I said. This typically allows for an increased depth of research in each case, and also the phenomena are studied in their natural context, which is very, very important. Case study research also takes the perspective of the people involved in the case, not directly the researcher also, which is another defining characteristic of case study research. We'll get into these a little bit more detail in a moment. So we're asking the question, why would case study research be useful? Why does somebody want to do it? And typically, as you see from the source which I've listed in the show notes, there will be 3 distinct reasons, at least coming from a sports science and research perspective. If your theory suggests a particular outcome or particular outcomes occur in a specific context, then you may use a case study with an environment indicative of this context in order to study this outcome. That may be one reason you'd conduct a case study. Also, to be able to explain a unique or rare situation or phenomena. An example of this, as we'll get into later in a little bit more detail, may be elite athletes' response to injury, which will formulate better theories and better ways to understand their perspective on the injury, and that will help form better rehabilitation programs and understanding. We'll get into that a little bit more later. And finally, to describe and explain a case that has yet to be studied in any meaningful way or in detail. These would be reasons that you would conduct a case study, typically. So when we're looking at case studies, we'll start off with the good. What are some of the good points of case study research? What are some of the pros of it? Well, one big pro of case study research is the depth of analysis that can be done with case studies. And the depth of the research conducted will be far higher than some other research types. You're also able to use many different data gathering techniques in order to form a wider picture of the overall situation. For example, you can use interviews, questionnaires, participant and situation observation. There's loads of tools at the researcher's disposal to get a very wide picture of a situation. It can also be used to inform further research and generate new ideas and new theories on a subject. And as well, they often have a systematic approach to them with how the research is going to be conducted, what case you're going to be looking into. It's not typically something which you can just shotgun and go and do. An opinion like anecdote can just be shotgunned and shot out there because everyone can have them. A case study does have a little bit more of a systematic approach than that, which is in its favor, most definitely. And also things like the chosen time frame and, as I said, data collection methods, they're all going to be chosen and approved and be made appropriate ahead of time. And the last point, one of the big points of case studies as well, is that it can be used to inform on subjects where quote unquote better study designs may struggle. An example of this, for example, would be a randomized control trial. We'll get into what randomized control trials are in later episodes, on professional bodybuilders studying different macronutrient distributions and protein intakes on, say, markers of hypertrophy in order to see what would be best for professional bodybuilders, for example. Good luck with that. Good luck with getting a sample of, 15, 20, 30 professional bodybuilders to let you, the researcher, or you, the person wanting to study this, have control over their diet. Good luck with that. They like to have a lot of autonomy and control over that. Hence why a lot of them wouldn't agree to this study, and hence why an RCT in this context may struggle. But you may get one or two. You may get one or two of that sample that say, okay, we'll do it, but it has to be over this time frame. And, they'll let you carry out the study on them for a short period of time or for a certain period of time. And then that can be useful. So a case study there would be more applicable than a randomized control trial, simply because you aren't going to get the participants necessary for a randomized control trial. So take that into account as well. But then the question needs to be asked, are there any cons? And yes, there are. I know I'm shaking the camera a lot, aren't I? There are cons to case studies. They typically have a very small sample size. It can be a single participant, be a few. But if it's a single participant, this drastically reduces its statistical power, i.e. the strength of the evidence, which is typically why you'll see case studies come towards the bottom of the evidence hierarchy, not directly at the bottom where anecdote and anything like that is. But again, a lot of statistical power is lost when the sample size is decreased. As well, it impacts its generalizability. What worked, as I touched on before, on looking at dietary recommendations, what worked for one person may not work for another, and so you have a very low generalizability with case studies because of this very, very low sample size. As well, and this makes making broad recommendations a lot of the times inappropriate because the sample size is simply not there. You can't generalize from a single person. As well, it studies a specific phenomena in a specific setting. So again, this can often impact its generalizability also for different people in different situations. So that's where higher participant numbers and looking at things like randomized control trials can come in handy. It also relies on the ability of the researcher, like any publication. This is a limitation that goes across all forms of scientific research, and that is that it relies on the strength of the researcher. The researcher has to be a good researcher in order for the quality of the publication, in order for the results to be valid. They need to know how to choose the correct data gathering methods. They need to have done their background research on what time frame they'll need, have a clear hypothesis, and stuff like that. So if the researcher is not a strong researcher, then everything in the study can be negatively impacted. And also, you have two distinct categories. Often you can see two distinct categories of case study research. You have grounded theory and ethnographic theory. We'll go over those two now. Grounded, typically an inductive approach where the hypothesis and theories are tested based on the initial measurements rather than having them predetermined. typically with other studies, you will have a hypothesis which you are testing as a result of your study to see whether it's true or untrue, or to see whether you can reject the opposite of that. That's conversation for another time on how hypotheses and null hypotheses work. Anyway, this theory, or rather this method, uses the baseline measurements of the study in order to formulate a hypothesis. And then through continuous testing, through continuous measurement, and the results, this theory is refined, and it's refined and refined and refined over time based on the results that come through. This is very, very useful. However, it's very, very time consuming. It requires a lot of skill and diligence. Again, going back to the skill and strength of the researcher. And as I said, it's very, very time consuming and can go beyond the scope of certain research projects. So it's not always the most useful. However, you then have something called an ethnographic method, which basically is where the researcher immerses themselves into the culture which they are studying. Think of it as you're a Westerner looking at activities of the Sam Bushmen, and they go and integrate themselves into that group for a period of time and study them basically from the inside, from the perspective of the group being, what's the word I'm looking for? Researched, on the perspective of the group being researched, rather. A good example of this is Ross Edgley done that exact thing. He went and spent a lot of time with the Sam Bushmen and living their way of life in order to learn about them. Details it a lot in his book, The World's Fittest Book. But anyway, as I said, this idea of immersing yourself into the culture of the group is what's called focusing on the emic perspective, or the group perspective, rather than the etic perspective, which is the perspective of the researcher. However, this can be very, very useful, but despite it being useful for some things, such as observing natural behaviors in their natural environment, range of methods that can be employed and stuff like that, you can gain understanding of the complex relationships within these social structures. There's a lot of the limitations can be traced back to a researcher named Giulianotti in 1995. And this is a really, really good example of some of the issues you can face with this type of research. In a 1995 study, he went into 2 groups of football hooligans in Scotland and highlighted 3 key things that can impact this type of case study research and some key challenges. The first one was regarding gaining entry. It can be difficult to gain entry to groups, and these groups were no different. They were very, very cautious of unsympathetic reporting, i.e. the possibility of condemnation by the researcher. How he got around this was he struck deals with each side by providing limited information about the other, and that was to gain trust with certain members within the group, and then he would use that in a technique that is called snowballing in order to use those members that he's already gained a bit of trust with. They would introduce him to other members, and that automatically increases the trust of yourself within the group. So that's a good technique that he used, and it was very, very instrumental in this study, particularly for his safety, as we'll get onto in a moment. But gaining entry to the group can be a major challenge. Think about the tribes that we have not made contact with in certain areas of the world, that you hear these horror stories about this evangelical person trying to go and make contact with them, and they get absolutely slain and cannibalized. Gaining entry in order to study certain groups can be very, very difficult. So that's one challenge with this ethnographic research, or ethnographic method, rather. There's also risks while conducting said research. Initial hostility from both groups was something that Giulianotti experienced. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but that's how I'm going to go with it. This snowballing technique helped him reduce much of that risk. It helped him gain trust within the group very, very quickly. And that's why we call it a snowball. Think of a snowball rolling down a hill. It starts very, very small, but as it goes, more and more snow attaches to it, and it gets bigger and bigger. By the time it gets to the bottom of the hill, it's absolutely huge, and if you get hit by it, you're probably going to die. Anyway, that was a tangent enough. But he noted that it reduced much of this risk. However, he did note that a researcher attempting to gain entry by other means would have been at much more of a risk. So being aware, oh, and he also noted that being aware in this specific instance of the difference between threat and banter was key to mitigating your risk. So there's obviously challenges with conducting the research. Once you're in the group, there's going to be challenges conducting the research as well. You might have all the research tools available, interviews, as I said, observation, questionnaires, etc., etc. But there's other things that you've got to be wary of within that culture. And finally, the validity of the data. And this one is really, really important. We're looking at drawing conclusions based on case studies. A number of questions regarding validity were raised from this research due to both groups, and this is going to sound hilarious. It's the most typically British thing you can imagine. Wanting to portray themselves as the hardest fans in Scotland. I gotta laugh when I read that. This provides, however, the key thing is that this provides a lot of motivation for these groups to either overrepresent their activities or misrepresent their activities to the researcher. And even without going into too much detail, you can see clearly how that's going to affect the actual objective result validity. There's motivation there to scuff the results. I love what Lane Norton says about data, and obviously making data objective, is that you can torture the data to make it fit what you want to believe, even if that's not actually what the data suggests. If you torture it enough, it will say what you want it to say. It's a bit like getting getting a forced confession out of a prisoner in a jail, even when they might not have done something. But if you put them under enough stress, they'll confess to anything. So that's why you got to question the validity of the results sometimes. However, we're going to be finishing this up with a really, really positive example of a case study that was conducted by a researcher by the name of Sparks in 2000. And he wanted to analyze and look at the experiences of elite athletes who had been cut short, whose careers, had been cut short by injury or illness. Now, again, if you are an athlete, you can imagine how, if you have an athletic career and it's suddenly cut short in a single moment, it's a change of life completely out of your control, a negative change of life out of your control in a single moment, and that can have drastic impacts on a person. To do this, in order to study this, he studied a single athlete. Now, the book I was reading where they talked about this, and I'll list it down in the notes below. They didn't name the athlete, and that's a big thing within research as well, is that all data remains confidential. It's confidentiality. But he studied a single athlete in a biographical fashion. And this involved the use and collection of life documents pertaining to this athlete and describing turning points in the individual's life, and also studying them from a variety of different perspectives in a very, very in-depth manner. And this was done through extensive interviews and a lot of time with the participant. And he found that the strong sense of identity that the person had of being an athlete, strong sense of athletic identity, actually acted more of an Achilles heel in terms of their reaction to injury or illness. It was actually a net negative. Although this is not necessarily generalizable to the wider population, this is useful, as understanding this Achilles heel could be useful to healthcare and physical activity professionals in better dealing with athletic injury and illness, and thus enhancing the recovery and experience of the athlete who's had this happen to them. And that's where this is a great example of where case study research can be really, really useful. I'm just reading my notes here for a minute. Yeah. So the big thing is that if this had been done, quote unquote, with a better study design, such as a randomized control trial with a lot more people, then this level of detail and this level of understanding these results could have been missed by the researcher, and then we might end up with, a net negative of having missed them. So this is where a case study came in very, very handy and was very, very useful for further informing areas of scientific research and potentially enhancing the experiences of recovering athletes. And there's other case studies that can case studies can extend into wider fields as well. It's not just in this one specific field. I thought that was a really, really good example to touch on the positives of a case study. And now we're just going to summarize what we've been over, really. Think of this as like your TLDR. So you've got a case study, which is a study of one situation or one group or one participant over a specific time frame. Again, you're looking at the phenomena in its natural setting, everything like that. It can be grounded or ethnographic, as we've talked about in this episode. And a case study is useful for getting a lot of depth of information on a given phenomena in a given setting, as I said. And you think of this as like your deep dive type of research. It's good for studying areas where higher quality study methods may struggle, as I said, with the randomized control trial example, looking at bodybuilders and different dietary regimens, or looking at, the sports recovery example that we looked at. And this can help inform further areas of research and further theories, which is very, very useful indeed. Limitations obviously are specific to the type of research you do, whether it's grounded or ethnographic, but overall limitations, low generalizability and low power. Also a little bit more risk of bias compared to things like systematic reviews, meta-analysis, randomized control trials. But again, all that we'll discuss when we get to those specific episodes. And as I said, those are the two main ones, as well as the limitations specific to grounded and ethnographic research. And that's why it's because of this low power and low generalizability, you need to exercise caution with case studies when applying like the results of them to yourself and trying to make big, broad, sweeping recommendations for like the general public based on them. Not appropriate to do that. But understand they can be useful in certain contexts. Then you may see something in a case study, or you may read something in a case study you think may be useful. You go and try it, and it actually does work for you. It's a bit like where anecdote can be useful on occasion, and something that somebody says may work for you. It's just when you say that it works for everybody, it's the best way to do something. That's not true whatsoever. And you shouldn't be doing it just based on things like a single case study or somebody's anecdote or individual mechanisms, as you'll see a lot of people do. So yeah, hope you enjoyed that, guys. Hope you found it useful. Again, leave your thoughts on all my social medias and everything like that, and have a good one. I'll catch you next time. Have a good one.